let's get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Thomas Logan from People Entry, and I'm the founder and one of the organizers of Accessibility New York City. Trying something new today. I think for those of you on YouTube, you may be seeing me, and for those of you that are here in person at the Andrew High School Library, I think you were just hearing my voice. So we're always innovating at this meetup. We've been doing this meetup for over 5 years, and this is our first meetup where we don't have a host in person.
Recording in progress.
But myself, Merrill Evans, Joseph Pepsner, Cameron Huda, and Sean Laureate are the organizers of the meetup, and for various reasons could not be there in person today. But we're really happy that you're able to come for today's November presentation. We want to thank Jolie McKee, who's there in the room, streaming us live. He's from the Accessibility Special Interest Group of the Internet Society of New York, and he has been providing our live stream to YouTube since the beginning of our meetup. All of our talks are streamed and are kept online on our YouTube page. So if you miss this talk or want to share this talk with someone else, you can always go and find a captioned and transcript version of the talk on our page. We want to say thank you to Whitney Riley from Texas Captioning for providing the captions for today's meetup. We always have human captioning at our Accessibility New York City events. And we want to say thank you to the Andrew High School Braille and Talking Book Library for hosting us. We love being able to have people come together in the physical space, and we welcome you all that were able to join us in person. Just a quick reminder from the library side, we will need to be out of the space by 7 p.m. sharp. I want to also say thank you to Merrill Evans for tirelessly helping us organize these events. And Merrill Evans and I are also responsible for doing the recaps and transcripts from these posts after the presentations are completed. We're able to have human captioning and other accessibility services thanks to our sponsors. So we want to say thank you to People Entry, Accessibility Consultancy, Events, and Automated Accessibility Solution, Fable, an accessibility platform powered by people with disabilities, and Google, heard of them, a global IT company. Now I want to introduce our speaker for today. We're really thrilled to have Bryan Stromer. Bryan is passionate about telling stories of brands that make our world a better place. Born with cerebral palsy, Bryan is a passionate advocate for the disability community and founded Microsoft's Disability and Marketing Group. And I had the pleasure of seeing Bryan speak with Satya Nadella, Microsoft's CEO, and YouTube. Extremely impressed. Bryan's writing and thought leadership has been published by the Washington Post, New York Times, and NPR. He's also been featured on the Today Show, Forbes, New York One, and the New York Daily News. After working at Microsoft, Bryan earned his master's at Tsinghua University as a Schwarzman Scholar, and Bryan currently works in the accessibility space as a senior product manager focused on customer experience at a large technology company. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Bryan. Thank you so much, Bryan, for being here with us today.
Hi, thanks so much, Thomas and team, for all the work that you did for putting this together, and thank you to everyone who's here in person and also tuning in. This is a topic that I find really fun and one that I think isn't really talked a lot about in the accessibility space. I think a lot of times we're very focused on the product, the code, and all of those great features that are so foundational to making something accessible, but then the question I've always had is what's next? How do we make sure that we're reaching people with disabilities with the same kind of vigor that we see brands go after any other set of consumers? So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how brands interact with disability. I'm going to start with kind of my own personal story, how I got involved in this space, and then go through some examples and also give some tips around accessibility. And then towards the end, we'll have time for Q&A and also just conversation. I find that these presentations are a lot more fun when people actually are engaged, and I get to learn from you too. So that's, I think, the piece that I'm looking most forward to. So I have just a quick agenda here. I kind of ran through this, but I'll talk about my story. We'll go through the case studies. Also just an interesting piece kind of around, and I think this is a good conversation starter, of like what does the future of accessibility look like? What are some trends, and then how can you become an advocate for accessibility. Especially, I think it's always interesting when people are maybe more focused on the tech side but work at brands or companies that have a big marketing arm or communications arm. How can you kind of infiltrate that space too? And let's see, I think I'm getting an echo.
Sorry to stop your flow, but this is just pointing a bit towards the speaker, and so it's...
I can hold it too if that's easier.
If you want to. But
Sure.
that's a little better. It's just sticking, facing up.
I could just hold it if that. Let's see. I may just hold it if this works. So this, I have on here a few images and I'll describe them all, but if you look to the left, there's actually an image that's a tweet that I was tagged in earlier this fall, and it was a really interesting one for me because somehow this person found, I think, probably the first instance of my advocacy work and how I got interested in accessibility. And what the tweet says is, famous students who had IEPs at New York City schools, and then I'm tagged and a bunch of other people, and it says, it hasn't been long since screen schools were actually forced to accept students with disabilities. The disability community should contribute to this conversation. And I thought this tweet was really interesting because it reminded me of, it links back to this article that I was kind of the poster child of in 2013, which was the year that I graduated from high school, where right below, I always remember in the Daily News, right below Kim Kardashian, so you knew it was like big news for the day, there was a headline and it said, Chancellor Walcott, so Dennis Walcott was the school's chancellor at the time, orders top high schools to admit students with disabilities or with special needs. And it was really personal to me because I had gone through the experience of applying to specialized high school in New York City, getting in based off of my test score, and then being told, well, we don't have any students like you, and how are you going to do things like the stairs? And being born with cerebral palsy, it's always interesting because it's a disability that people can see when I walk into the room, but I also am able to, I'm able to do pretty much what I want to do on a regular basis. I mean, I always say, if we're going to go climbing a mountain, that might not be for me, but for my day-to-day, I'm pretty good. And I think this really just stuck out because it shows, this is 2013, this is not long ago that we were still segregating schools. And I think it's important to think about this when we think about marketing, because when you're approaching people, this is the mentality that a lot of people have grown up with around disability. They haven't maybe had people with disabilities in their schools, in their classrooms when they were growing up, or in their workplaces. So when they think about disability, they're still kind of tapping into this very dated model that we know about, where we see people with disabilities being represented as unemployed, as not capable to contributing to society, as not having value, as not being able to do things like be in romantic relationships or have children. So it was just a good reminder, and I kind of wanted to just start with that. My advocacy journey, I think, really, though, began when I went to school. I went to Vanderbilt. I got a scholarship through an organization called the Posse Foundation, which recruits New York City public school students and sends them to schools like Vanderbilt. And when I was at Vanderbilt, I kind of saw that same thing that I talked about in the previous slide, where Vanderbilt had essentially, their Office of Students with Disabilities was actually located off of campus. It was located in a building that was essentially the dining warehouse, and then the Office for People with Disabilities. So that was a 15-minute walk for me, which I was like, that's really interesting that, you have a large population of people with mobility disabilities and they're being forced to walk these distances. And when I kind of raised this, I was told, well, a lot of students don't want to be seen entering this space and kind of labeled as disabled or having a disability. So again, we see the stigma actually having real world ramifications on people and people's lives. For me, and this is where I kind of started to find my voice and actually understand the importance of changing representation, I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I got the feeling Vanderbilt was trying to kind of wait me out because, the nice thing about universities is their student population refreshes every 4 years. So if there's an issue they don't want to deal with, they just wait for those students to graduate. So on my graduation date, I ended up writing a piece for the Washington Post, and there's a tweet that I took a screenshot of, and it's to the left, and it says, "I go to a top university known for its research in disabilities, yet students like me are an afterthought." And I love this. This tweet just came out below it in September, but it says, "Vanderbilt Student Access Office provides a wide range of services to students with disabilities, has upgraded its facilities. Learn about the office, which has moved to a state-of-the-art space in the heart of campus." So I think kind of this idea, okay, I think I'm getting a better microphone, sorry. Thank you. Can you hear? Is it? I don't.
I'll turn it up a
Okay,
bit.
perfect.
Yeah. Okay, try now.
Can you hear me now? Yes, I think that's good. But again, I think this idea of kind of constantly running into people's assumptions about me as a person with a disability and then seeing the ramifications and then wanting to change that is really how I got interested in marketing, and it explains a lot of how I approach and kind of my philosophy on accessibility. This is like the last slide with me, I promise. But basically, my career after that has been getting to work on understanding at Microsoft how really my 5 to 9 p.m. job at Microsoft, I like to say, was starting our disability and marketing group, which was we kind of had all these other groups that were basically mini employee resource groups, and what I said is, why don't we have one for disability? I mean, Microsoft that year had just run a Super Bowl ad featuring a person with a disability, so I was really adamant about that, and got to secure funding and a pretty significant budget each year, and we grew that group to be the fastest growing kind of group within our marketing team of people signing up to join this community. So up there I have a picture, and it's from an event I did with Adweek where it says, "It's not enough to just write a story about a person with a disability. We need people with disabilities to write their own stories and not have it written for them," which is something that I really strongly believe in, why I kind of always want to see more people with disabilities in marketing roles and roles around storytelling, is this idea that, we so often see other people trying to capture the narrative of disability. I mean, we know even in film there's big controversies because often people with disabilities or characters with disabilities are played by non-disabled actors. And it's really interesting because at the same time we know that there's historically people with disabilities have struggled to gain meaningful employment. So why, when there are these opportunities that are specific to really designed for people with disabilities, are we not giving it to them? This is an event I did with PR Week down there, and it talks about, I don't love the title, I feel like it's very dramatic, but fighting fears, suppressing stigmas. But I like that because I'm on it with Megan Smith, who I'm at Amazon now, so she's one of my coworkers there, which is really fun. And then in the middle, this is probably my favorite photo, but it's a photo of me and 4 other people, and we're in front of a sign that says GAD, so Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and this is actually in Beijing, China. So I was in China last year, and I was like, why, or what are we doing for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which when I was at Microsoft was a very big deal, and everyone was kind of like, oh, what is that? So we actually, I worked with Tsinghua University, where I was a master's student, and it's kind of the most prestigious university in China, to do their first ever Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And we worked with brands like Lenovo and Walmart China, which I thought, I could go into a whole talk on that, but really interesting to understand what is the view of disability in China, and for me, what I found most interesting is how can brands like Microsoft that have a big business in China and really value disability and see it as a source of innovation, how can they bring those beliefs to China and help shift the challenges that people there face around kind of the historic stigmatization. And then this last one is just a photo with me and Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, where I got to present when they were rolling out PowerPoint, rolled out live captioning features. So I got to kind of show him that. And I thought I like this photo because I think a lot of times companies bring in diverse talent, but don't always give them the opportunities to shine and actually promote them and raise them up. And this was a really it took him like 5 minutes, but for me, it's still one of my favorite moments of my career. So I think that's another important lesson is always, don't just worry about recruiting talent, but think about bringing in talent, retaining it, and then how do you give them opportunities to. Okay, so now this is more of kind of a practical side, but I want to talk about some case studies where we've seen brands really lean into disability and accessibility inclusion. This is one, I love the story of Nike because Nike is a brand that I think, even if you were asked them, did not always have it right. Originally, I think Nike is also interesting because when you think about sports historically is something that hasn't really been accessible for people with disabilities. Yes, there are kind of special instances like the Special Olympics or Paralympics, but historically I've never felt like I could just walk onto a soccer team and get picked. And Nike kind of has this mantra of being, if you have a body, you're an athlete, which I think is interesting, kind of really pushing into this idea that everyone's an athlete in some way, shape, or form. But in 2018, I grabbed this tweet, and it's ironic that I keep grabbing tweets to storytell, given everything that's happened with Twitter's accessibility team. If you haven't heard, they are all gone. This tweet says, athletes with disabilities shared mixed feelings after Nike signs runner with cerebral palsy. So there's this really interesting piece where it wasn't actually like an official Nike video, but one of those kind of like clickbaity Facebook content creation, I almost call them like factories because I feel like a lot of their videos are so generic, but they put together this clip of Justin, who's a runner at University of Oregon who had cerebral palsy, and it was this very kind of inspirational video of him running, and it felt a little bit like inspiration porn. So I think we're all probably familiar with that term, but basically this idea that people with disabilities are not here to inspire you. We shouldn't be celebrated for just living our lives, for doing things that everyone else can do. So this clip very much felt like that, though. Like people were saying, well, is every Nike athlete who's getting signed having this whole like mantra created about them? And I think what I really liked is how Nike handled the situation. So one, they said, this wasn't actually our official collateral, but let's work with the disability community and Justin, the athlete, to create actually a video that, both him and Nike as a brand can feel proud of. But then kind of going further, if you lean forward a few years, you'll see they started coming out with like the Fly Ease, which if you're not familiar with that, the Fly Ease, I have a picture of it, and it's a shoe where in this instance, instead of shoelaces, there's like zippers, so you can zipper closed, and it's really great for people with dexterity issues or certain mobility issues. And it was an interesting piece because they approached the marketing of this very differently. So the first kind of video that I saw is this product was actually inspired by someone with a disability. I want to say it might be cerebral palsy, but I'm biased, so I'm not going to say that. But he wrote to Nike and he said, I love your shoes, but I can't wear them because I think it goes to shoelaces and some other factors. So they actually went and created an adaptive shoe for him. But then when they came out with the marketing for that, they The video very much featured him kind of as a co-designer, which I thought was really interesting. One kind of mistake that we often see brands doing is when they talk about disability, they don't actually have the person with the disability speaking. It's usually like the parents are like, I am so proud of this person for waking up in the morning and all of that. But Nike really shined a light on not Justin, this is Justin, but on the designer of the person with the disability who wrote and kind of had the idea for this shoe. And then they also worked with athletes with disabilities to kind of show how that could be helpful for them. And then on top of that, they've started to integrate disability a little bit more into their regular marketing too. So like this is just an example that I found on the Nike webpage below, and it's I think a teenager who is in a wheelchair and just kind of dressed head to toe in Nike, raising her hands. And that's important too. You know, you want to normalize this idea that people with disabilities are part of our society. So yes, it's great that we feature them when we do things like this adaptive shoe or the Xbox adaptive controller, but I also want to see them as part of the regular rhythm of casting. Some really interesting work that's been done in the past is Verizon Media and Getty, or it's now Oath, I think they rebranded, but they did a collection where they actually worked on getting more people with disabilities to be represented in stock photography, because stock photography, I mean, it's very undervalued, but when you think about it, you know, especially when you're in marketing, you're going and you're searching images and you're putting them on these posters and in textbooks, and they're showing up everywhere, stock photography. And if you don't have any people with disabilities, then we're kind of erasing them from all of these different elements of society, which becomes very important. And again, how do we view disability? What are the stigmas surrounding people with disabilities, and how do we change that? So that's an example where I like it, where, you know, I think they kind of got it wrong at the beginning, but you can see that they've corrected it. Now they actually have a fun story about the Fly-E's. Is they actually got in some more trouble with the disability community a little while ago, because the Fly-E's sneakerheads really loved the adaptive shoe, and they were selling out of the shoe before anyone with disabilities could buy it. So that was interesting. And I mean, I think one of my friends now works on accessibility at Nike, and it was interesting, because it's like one of those things where originally when you order, a lot of these brands like Target has accessibility, adaptive clothing, but they order them in very kind of, in comparison to their other products, very small quantities, because they expect it to be very specialized. So this was an interesting example of it going very mainstream and them not being prepared for it. But now I think when they order, they're ordering a much higher quantity of sneakers, and they now, if you go on Nike, they have a whole collection of Fly-E's. One tip that I would give to Nike is, I don't think you can go into the retail stores though and find these shoes. So I would love to see like their flagship stores that are all over New York carry this shoe too, and not just have where you kind of have to mail order it. This was, I think, my favorite example of a successful marketing campaign. This was Netflix released Crip Camp, which is basically really a film that highlights this camp that is for people with disabilities, but it really became kind of this breeding ground of disability advocates. So like Judy Heumann is featured, and it was, I think, really just significant for Netflix, because it was one of the first major films that they put out on their platform that really focused exclusively on disability. And what I loved what they did, which I thought was so cool and kind of innovative, is they partnered with Andrea Levant, who has this consulting service called Levant Consulting, and basically I've worked with them at Microsoft. What they do is they are a BIPOC women-owned consulting group of disabled women, and they work with brands to think about, like, how do you engage the disability community? How do you bring authentic representation? How do you make your events accessible? And for this was kind of their first big project. And here I'll just describe the slides, but we have basically what it is on the lower quadrant, the lower left quadrant, we have a poster that says Crip Camp Online Summer Training Series, May 17th through August 30th. And throughout that period, each week they had events, and it was all conducted over Zoom, where they would engage the disability community in various topics like grassroots advocacy, how to kind of like get PR, like pitch an article to a publication, so different topics like that. And Obama's production company was the producer of Crip Camp. So for one of the events, she actually, and this is Obama and Andrea. So Obama is on the left and then Andrea is on the right, and she's dressed kind of as a camp counselor to play into this idea of Crip Camp. And he came to one of the Zoom calls, and it was super cool just to see that. And then below is Andrea's team. But what I really loved about this example is, one, Netflix included people with disabilities from the start and really gave them the ability to lead there. And they included, I think they intentionally selected a company that was very diverse and represented a spectrum of the disability experience, because it's very easy to focus on one disability or one race when you're thinking about disability, but it's important to understand that just like we think about diversity, equity, inclusion in any other space, we also have to think about it within disability. So they did that successfully. I really liked that they made sure the event was accessible from the get-go. So all of the events that they did on Zoom, they had live captioning, they had a sign language interpreter, they had places to request accommodations. And it was interesting because even though it was all sponsored and they were hired by Netflix, you really got to develop a relationship with other advocates within the disability community. So that's how I actually met Andrea, was through just attending this campaign and seeing what an amazing job she did with that. So that I thought was a really great example, and probably my favorite one of how brands have brought in disability and people with disabilities and accessibility. And then I think there's also this piece on product truth, though, and I'm working a little bit backwards, but in order to have accessible marketing, an accessible brand, you have to have product truth. So your products have to be accessible. And again, that's kind of the most important piece for me. It's not always where I jump to because I'm very marketing kind of brain, but it's important. This is a screen grab from Target's adaptive line. So they have like a women's jacket. I think this is, I'm not going to be great at describing these articles of clothing, but I think this is almost like a onesie with like a t-shirt on top, and then you see there's like snaps, and then the next one is a sweater, and it also I think has at the bottom like a snap-in type piece. So really they all have physical modifications to make it easier for people with disabilities to get dressed. But I wonder, how sustainable is this? Because again, the audience is limited. So with Target, you can't walk into your Target and get these pieces. You have to order them online. The line is rather limited. There's maybe, when I check, 20 pieces, but I'm pretty sure we all have, more than 20 articles of clothing. So how do you kind of move? How do you have a big enough line? And then the little secret about this is they're not really super profitable, because to make it at a price point that is in line with Target, they're not getting the volume that they would normally be able to achieve to get those price points. So a lot of these items, and I don't know about Target's situation, but a lot of this, and Tommy Hilfiger has a similar adaptive line, Zappos has an adaptive collection, are actually sold at a loss. So I mean, that's one of the things that, in the future I want to think about is how do we start to bring things forward and make them a little bit more sustainable, where it's not just, you know, a nice thing to do, but it's actually good business practice to do that. I was even thinking about, so I went to Uniqlo the other day, and it was really interesting. I was looking at jeans there, and for the first time ever, I saw where you select your waist size, but then every jean is a size 34 length, and then they give you the option to alter it for free. And it made me think about like this adaptive fashion kind of idea, like what if instead of having specific pieces with like certain snap-ons, we gave people the ability to customize, kind of like Uniqlo is doing, where instead of having to produce a jean in every length, they're just cutting it to order. And that was a really interesting concept to me. And when I was looking a little bit more into this, I saw that Microsoft is actually moving in this direction a little bit. So they just came out with a bunch of adaptive accessories, and they partnered with this brand or a company called Shapeways, which actually prints the adaptive accessories on demand for you. So you can get like little like modifiers for your computer that will like snap on and change, and there's a picture of that, and but it's all printed on demand. And I think was what I really want to look into, like, what is the economics behind this too, and is that something that is going to be more sustainable versus this idea of just kind of continuously making new products, which can feel very splashy, but at the end of the day, if they're not available in any of the stores, and they're being produced in a very limited quantity, how long will these brands sustain it for? Or will an executive lose interest, and then the sponsorship for that is gone? And then I think I described this, but on the left we have Uniqlo's product page, and you can see it below, and it's a little bit blurry here, but there is a box to actually select your length and what style of cutoff you want, which I thought was really cool. This might be more of why you all actually came here, but I just wanted to kind of put together, I always like to make sure that people are like leaving with something specific. I wanted to put together some simple tips that I think about for driving accessibility forward in marketing. One of the first things I think is ask your teams, your comms teams, your marketing teams, what are you doing to make your work accessible? I mean, I bet you if you're not at an accessibility-focused organization, they might be a little bit lost and kind of stare at you. But I think just asking that is a great way to start that conversation. And then there are a bunch of resources online, and I'll work with Thomas to put a list together, and you can send them out. But there's a bunch of, like Google, for example, put together, if you just Google accessible marketing, they actually have a whole toolkit that they put together for kind of marketing and comms teams around things like how to make your events accessible, how to make your social media accessible. So a lot of great resources, but I think the first step is just to ask if you're not the person doing that. Another great tool that I like is using the accessibility checker. So both Google Suite and Office have an accessibility checker. They've located it right next to kind of spell check, and it's a really nice reminder to add things like alt text to your to your pictures. So when you have a picture on a slide, are you adding text that's actually describing what is on that picture? Or you kind of saw, I hope I did a good enough job, but you kind of saw when I had all these pictures on the slide, so I was trying to describe them as I went through them in case anyone was blind or low vision and wasn't seeing those slides. And then adding alt text to your social media work. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all have really great features to add alt text to your social media work without actually distorting the kind of creative behind the work. I think that's a big barrier, is a lot of people who work in advertising and marketing are very kind of snobby about their work and are like, oh, if you add this alt text here, it's going to ruin the aesthetic, or if you don't have they might have text that's not on a high enough contrast background, but it's their brand color. So, trying to, I think, explain why things like having high contrast text against the background is important, but then also showing them that places like Facebook and Instagram have already built in these features that make it really easy for you to add alt text is important. And with TikTok and a lot of these Instagram shorts now, you can add in the captioning too. And that's, the captioning is an interesting one. I mean, usually it's AI captioning, which isn't great because we know that AI isn't as great as a human captioner like we have here. But AI captioning is a good place, I think, to start. And what they can do then is use the AI captioning and then watch it over to make sure that it's actually correct and captioned. But and they should actually be captioning even if they're not thinking about accessibility, because it's actually become a best practice within social media, since so many of us watch these reels or videos on mute anyway. You'll see a lot of influencers who I'm sure are not doing it for accessibility, adding captioning in. And then I think, using stock photography that highlights the diversity of disability. So Disability In, for example, has an open source stock photography library that features people with disabilities. Getty has a disability collection within their stock photography. I think Getty charges for it, but trying to just make sure that you have disability represented as part of the human experience when you're trying to capture all of these different people in your stock photography. Hiring people with disabilities to consult and work with you. I think this is probably the most important thing, actually, is like, I really love that I get to be in a room sometimes, and an executive might not agree with me, but I can just say, like, from my experience as a person with a disability, this is what I believe. And there's nothing they can really say to that, because if we're talking about accessibility, they don't know what's going on. And I think it's important, though, to have people who have those lived experiences to be part of the conversation. And again, we know that people with disabilities face higher rates of unemployment or underemployment, so why not give them an opportunity to bring something to your organization. And then ask your agencies to hire people with disabilities. If you're not in the marketing or kind of creative or comms world, a lot of brands don't actually do their own work or have it in-house. It's usually all outsourced to agencies, and a lot of these agencies are relatively small, so they might, not know about some of the things I talked about, but they also might not have people with disabilities on their agency side. So if you're asking for work that features people with disabilities or is accessible, you should be saying, I want someone, how do you plan to bring in people with disabilities to review this work or to look this over? That is, at least, you can't really say hire them, but you can say, how are you going to bring them into this process? I think is important. And when you do bring them in, pay them. I think it's, a lot of times I'm shocked to see brands want to bring in people with disabilities, but also people from all different marginalized backgrounds, and not pay them for their work, or do things like, oh, I'll give you a $20 gift card for this. And especially a lot of people who are doing this professionally, this is how they earn their income. So be respectful of that and make sure that you're actually paying a fair wage for their work. And then finally, make sure that you're advocating for disability to be part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I remember when I was applying for jobs, and again, not that long ago out of college, it was amazing to me to be able to look through different diversity statements of companies and see that disability was not represented or even talked about or addressed in that space. And that's still something that's very common. So I think, when you're all having these conversations or being brought into meetings and you're not seeing disability represented, say something, or say, hey, why are we not talking about this? Or what are we doing to bring in this perspective? Awesome. So I think that is pretty much my presentation and what I had to talk about. But I wanted to open up the floor and see if there are any Q&As. I think we have some in the room.
We do have a mic here.
Okay, and then I don't know how we're going to do it for the people who are online.
I think maybe Thomas or someone will come on and ask those questions. But first, is anybody in the room? Yes? Okay, here it is.
Thanks for I don't know if this is on, but I'm going to talk. Thanks for the great presentation. I really loved your example about where Nike failed and then they went and tried again, and then they were successful. I find that more than not, companies are even scared to fail when it comes to disability. So could you sort of provide some just ideas about how to motivate a company to feel safe and why it's important to pursue it, even if you are first going to fail? Yeah,
I think that's a great question. And my answer to that would be, I think, is provide guardrails. So I know one thing that we did at Microsoft, which is really helpful, is our group, which was our disability marketing group, which was mainly comprised of people with disabilities. We would offer to review work before it went out and before it had the opportunity to become a big mess if it was perceived wrong. So that was an example of a guardrail where we said, it's okay if you get it wrong in this space or on this meeting, because none of us are going to go screenshot this and share this out. But it's important to do this work, so we're willing to provide the feedback on that. So I think one is providing guardrails. I mean, I think I always struggle. The disability community, rightfully so, can be very critical sometimes when things go wrong. And I mean, what I always look for as a person with a disability, I mean, even people say things to me that I'm sometimes like, how do you feel okay saying this? But I look and I say, think about, what is the intention here? So I really value, even if they get it wrong, I really value that at least someone is thinking about disability in this conversation. I would almost rather they kind of get it wrong and they're at least trying to think about disability, but versus not address it at all. But I haven't gotten a huge, I don't know if I have a perfect answer. I know, so Becky Kukula, who I'm friends with, I know you're friends with, so was there anything that you did at Snapchat or when you were
you know me,
yes.
Hi.
See, the accessibility space is very small.
I was going to come say hi after and do the formal introduction. But yes, hi, I worked at Snapchat. I actually got your email from Judy Human, and then like 5 minutes later, they did layoffs, so hi. Still looking if anybody knows the team. But that being said, one of the things that we focused on was the wheelchair emojis. And for those of you who are familiar with the Bitmojis, those are the cartoon characters with Snapchat. And so it's actually designed after my wheelchair. I cannot take the credit because I worked with an entire team of designers, and it was months and months in the process and critiquing, saying you failed here, you're wrong here, and this is right, this is wrong. And that process is really something that is so integral to branding disabilities, is making, as to your point, I'd rather them see both us and other individuals invited to the table for these discussions and fail versus not be in the discussion at all. And I think that when you do that, and even those of us who are professionals in the space are willing to put our reputations out there and saying, hey, we've been working with them and we will continue to work with them, is a really great way to help support organizations feel safe and increase that work, but also be a bridge and a conduit to the disabled community. Truly, like, I think that, I've tried many times to get more things done, but companies are often scared. So it's a journey.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's some questions online. So Can I throw it to Thomas?
Yeah.
All right, great. Hi, everyone. This is Thomas coming as a voice in the room and maybe on video. I'm going to take a question from YouTube. Observation, most disabilities are non-apparent. I've mostly seen people with apparent disabilities depicted in campaigns with visuals. How would you recommend people with non-apparent disabilities be represented and included in media and visual marketing?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, and I think even the example of like the wheelchair is often the symbol of disability. So we see that be something that's really kind of used as a representation. I think, in terms of non-apparent disabilities, I've seen some interesting work done where I've seen maybe on the person's screen, you'll see some sort of like focus software. I've seen that kind of done at Microsoft. I really like the use of text like overlay over the pictures. So again, these disabilities are non-apparent, so you're not going to get it from just glancing at the photos. So I like sometimes they'll have like a text kind of thought bubble where the person might talk about how their non-apparent disability is affecting them and then have that over the photography, which I think that's an interesting approach. I mean, it's also interesting because I've even thought about this. So I've been in stock photography around disability, and the funny thing with me is when I'm sitting down or really standing up, you can't even tell that I have a disability. So, and I've thought about like, should I be in these photographs if they want people with disabilities? But I also think that that's part of disability is it's not always going to be in your face like, oh, this person has a disability. So I think sometimes even with the non-apparent disabilities, it's fine if it's not clear that they have that. But I think, if you're authentically casting someone who has a non-apparent disability, then that I see that as progress still. And then I think if you really need to show that they have a non-apparent disability, there are those other techniques like the text overlay, or you could think about their screen, or even like how they're positioning their desk. Or I've seen like really interesting work where for people who are low vision, which you might not be able to tell if they are, they'll have like the screen, they'll show their screen that being like super zoomed in, which is interesting. So that work I really like.
Thank you, Bryan, so much. If you can take a question from the room, and then we'll take another question from online if there is another
Perfect.
question. Thanks.
Hi, I work at a university, and when the topic of accessibility is talked about, it's usually to prevent litigation. How can I actively encourage them to do more?
I love your question because when I go back to the Vanderbilt example, it's funny in my slide, the new center they named was the Student Access Center. The old center was called Disabilities, Equal Opportunity, Affirmative Action, and Disability Services, and it was run by the university's legal team. And so I think it's very much still a thing, especially in higher ed settings where disability is about compliance and avoiding lawsuits. And I think the way that I've seen it talked about, and I've been lucky to work at very innovative companies, but talked about that I think is powerful in the corporate space a lot of times is disability as a source of innovation. So thinking about how creating experiences that are accessible are just creating better experiences. So for example, an example I love to give is when I'm on a plane, I get really annoyed when some of the movies don't have captioning because, and it's not that I need the captioning, but it is so loud on a plane that I don't want to have my headphones on full volume, and I don't need to develop another disability. And so it's nice to have the captioning, and that's an example where that tool was built for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, but everyone benefits from that. I think there was a recent study where it said like 70% of people who are using captioning now don't need it. It's a very like millennial Gen Z thing. So to kind of answer your question a little bit specifically more, I would lean away from all of the compliance and legal things and start to show a little bit more of the innovation side. This is controversial, but you'll see a lot of people, advocates, start to lean into like this idea of inclusive design or and kind of those, which I think are a little bit sexier sometimes than just like accessibility and compliance. So I think trying to tell the full story where compliance and accessibility still play an important role and all of the laws there are still important, but also what work are we doing to talk about inclusive design, and what work are we doing to talk about disability culture and framing, again, disability as part of the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation, where it's like, hey, we have leaders in this space. What are we doing to study and include that in our curriculum too? So I think my approach for that has always been trying to bring in all of the other elements of the disability experience so that, yes, compliance will always be a part of it, but it's not the only conversation. Yeah.
Places, and I agree with it being, from an administrative perspective, a liability issue, but at the same time, professors have a lot of control over the classroom. I think if you targeted the professors, they'll do it. They can do it too, and that could be a very interesting technique. Talks about it.
Okay, Thomas, you just dropped off the picture. You
Yeah, so we'll take a question here from online. How may I start a conversation about accessibility in marketing and physical accessibility?
So that's an interesting question. So I understand it correctly, I'm hearing it as, how do I start a conversation about accessibility in marketing and physical accessibility? I mean, I think that would depend for physical accessibility on like what line of business are you in. So if you're a Target, like a Target Corporation, physical accessibility is going to be super important, thinking about the accessibility of your stores, of your fulfillment center, of all of that. And that really, I think, is going to be, and that kind of goes into product truth, because in a lot of ways, Target, their product is their stores and the manifestation of that. Versus if it's like a place of employment, I mean, that's harder because then that gets into more of like the HR side of accessibility and what are we doing from an accommodation standpoint? Is our physical space accessible? Meaning, you know, are there stairs? Is it barrier free? So I think really what I would try to do is understand what the specific business you're in is. Is there product truth to kind of having that physical space be accessible? If the answer is yes, I would definitely connect it to that. So your marketing should talk about, if you're Target, how your stores are accessible, what you're doing to make those spaces accessible. If maybe the physical space isn't as customer facing, it's still super important, because again, I believe the best way to become accessible is by hiring more people with disabilities, and you're not going to have people with disabilities working at your company or your space if your space isn't accessible. But it might be a little bit more challenging to connect it to the actual marketing element.
All right, so this is Thomas. I'm just going to have to put in the time constraint here for today. For those of you all in the room with Bryan, I hope you all can have some conversations in the room afterwards. We have some more questions for you, Bryan, that we'll share with you in email, and I think you have your contact slide on the last slide.
Yes. And my email is just bstromer, STROMER @gmail.com. So bstromer @gmail.com.
Great. So we want to say thank you so much, Bryan, for the awesome presentation today. We really appreciate having you here and for all the information that you shared and for the real examples also that you shared. We want to let everyone know again that we want to thank our sponsors for the event, Equal Entry, Events, Fable, and Google. We want to thank Jolie McPhee, who's there in the room with you in New York City from the Accessibility Special Interest Group of the Internet Society of New York, for providing our live stream to YouTube. And we want to thank the Andrew Heiskell Braille and Talking Book Library for hosting us. Thank you again to Whitney Riley from Texas Captioning for providing the amazing captions for today's meetup. We will be having our next meetup in December. It's going to be an online only meetup. We have a great presenter who's coming back to speak about breaking into the accessibility industry. It's be a great follow-on from Bryan's talk today. And we'll be having an in-person event again in January. So thank you again so much for those of you all joining us both on YouTube and in person, and we hope to see you at our next event. And thank you again, Bryan, so much.
Thank you.